A biological community is a group of different populations of different species that happen to live close enough that they could potentially interact with one another and affect one another's fitness. One example might be the carrier crab, and it carries a sea urchin on its back that helps protect it against predators and therefore impacts its fitness. So here's this little guy, and it provides legs that are larger and more quick than the tube feet that the urchin has, so it can move around more effectively, and the urchin helps protect the crab because of the spines that it has. In these interspecific interactions, or interactions between species, can be characterized by whether they affect the fitness of each species positively or negatively or not at all. And so, we usually put a little plus or a little minus or a little zero for a neutral interaction. So parasitism, for instance, positively impacts the parasite, right? It provides you with nutrients, but it negatively impacts the host. So that would be a plus-minus interaction. One of the most common kinds of interactions you see between species is competition. If you're competing for any of the same resources, that could be food or habitat or whatever it may be, water, minerals, sunlight, that negatively impacts both of you, right? Even if one species is outcompeting the other, they're still negatively impacted by losing some of their resources to the other species. And if two species happen to be competing over the exact same resources for long enough, eventually one of them will entirely and completely outcompete the other, right? It happens over time, but this is a principle called competitive exclusion, meaning if you're competing over the same role or the same niche in an ecosystem or a community, one of them is going to win essentially and push out the other species. When I say ecological niche, I'm talking about all of the resources that a particular species uses. So that could be biotic resources like what you eat, or abiotic resources like the water that you use, or if you're plants, you may use a lot of phosphorus or nitrogen or something. Again, if you have an identical niche, you cannot coexist in the exact same space indefinitely. Eventually, one species is going to outcompete. That said, you can coexist if you're similar species, as long as there are one or more significant differences in your niche, in the way that you make your living as an organism. This is called resource partitioning. So essentially, if I move into an area and there's another organism similar to me and we're fighting it out because we go for the exact same resources, it might then benefit me to start using a slightly different habitat or a slightly different food or coming out at a different time of day or something that means, yes, maybe I'm not using exactly the same niche that I truly would benefit from using in an ideal scenario, but the lack of competition means I do better by eating a slightly different food. For example, earlier this semester, you guys did a lab where you looked at a bunch of different anolis lizards that initially were probably very similar, came from very similar ancestors, but they have partitioned the resources in this habitat. Some of them became better over time, over evolutionary time, at living in the top branches, right? Some of them became better at living on the trunks, and some of them became better at living on the ground or in the underbrush or on fences. And because selection, with all the competition, selection made it more advantageous for them, made them more fit if they were better at doing something slightly different, you end up getting this resource partitioning over time due to natural selection with this competition. So in essence, an organism really has two niches. It has what we call its fundamental niche, which is the niche that it could potentially occupy without any competition at all, right? Theoretically, it could occupy this space. Now, maybe it's not as good at the tops of trees as another species that happens to exist in that area. So it doesn't exist in the tops of trees because it's outcompeted up there. It only exists on the trunks. But if that other species weren't there competing, it would spread and be in the tops of trees. So its fundamental niche includes the treetops, but its realized niche is just the tree trunks, right? It's the niche that's actually occupied by that particular species. And so a classic example of this has to do with barnacles. So this right here, Tithalamus maybe, is a type of barnacle that tends to live pretty high up, right? It does not get much water even during high tide and none during low tide, right? And then down here we get the Balanus barnacles. And this is what you see in the wild. But experiments were done to see if the realized niche that we see here is different from the fundamental niche of these Tithalamus barnacles. And so in small areas, all of the Balanus barnacles were taken away. And indeed, these barnacles spread down into the lower parts of the intertidal zone where the water was all the time, right, even at low tide. And that shows us that this is their fundamental niche. They can live in this entire area, but they're outcompeted down here by the Balanus barnacles in real life, right? And so their fundamental niche is this whole habitat, but their realized niche is just this upper area where they're able to outcompete Balanus, which requires more access to water. So those barnacles displayed resource partitioning, and the resource was the habitat, the position where they lived on that cliff. The common spiny mouse and the golden spiny mouse show temporal partitioning, meaning different times, right? Both species are typically nocturnal. They're active during the night. But in areas where they coexist and they're in competition with one another, the golden spiny mouse becomes diurnal because it gets outcompeted at night, and so it has to change its niche to something that benefits it in the competition. So our cute little golden spiny mouse, it exists during the day, but only in areas where it's in competition with the other mouse. In addition to divergence that you see in terms of resources that organisms are acquiring when they're in competition, you can also get, over time, evolution that displaces characters. So characteristics tend to be more divergent in sympatric populations, so species that live with each other, than in allopatric populations when they're not living with one another. And that's because when they're living with one another, they're in more competition, and they have to do that resource partitioning thing that we talked about. And sometimes different characteristics help them with these different resources that they're now going after. As an example of character displacement, we'll go back to Darwin's finches, which just seem to be a classic example of everything, which might be why they helped tip him off about this whole natural selection thing. But we have two species of finches, right? Phlegonosa and Fortis. And they live on separate islands, Los Hermanos and Daphne. And Phlegonosa lives alone on Los Hermanos, Fortis lives alone on Daphne, and as you can see, their beak depth is pretty similar. Fortis is a hair bigger on average, but they're very similar. On Santa Maria and San Cristobal, those are islands where they live together. Both of the birds live on these two islands. All of a sudden, you see very different beak depths. Phlegonosa has evolved smaller beaks, and Fortis has evolved larger beaks, deeper beaks. Because now that they're in competition, they have to partition resources and they have to eat different food. And so instead of having these jack-of-all-trades beaks, Fortis has to eat bigger stuff, and Phlegonosa has to eat smaller stuff. And so over time, natural selection has pushed them to have deeper and shallower beaks. So this is character displacement, which is a result of resource partitioning. While competition is a negative interaction, right? Both species in that interspecific interaction are harmed. Predation is a plus-minus interaction because the predator benefits from this interaction. They get food, but the prey species obviously dies, and so that would qualify as a negative interactions. And you tend to see specific characters that evolve in predators versus prey over time to help them get better at what they're doing. So predators often have feeding adaptations like claws and teeth and fangs or stingers or poisons, things like that. Prey organisms that are trying to escape from those predators often have a whole different set of adaptations. They may be hiders, right? They don't walk in the open like a predator does. They tend to hide or flee. They might be fast. They may form herds or schools. They may have spines for self-defense or alarm calls if they are social species. And they may also have physical adaptations like cryptic coloration so they can hide more easily. All right, it makes this easier. Camouflage, for instance, makes prey difficult to spot. So here you can see an example of cryptic coloration. Or maybe you can't see it because this canyon tree frog looks a lot like the rocks that it lives on in the canyon. But cryptic coloration is not the only kind of coloration that prey species can evolve. Sometimes they have evolved warning colorations. And this could be because of toxins, for instance. So poison dart frogs have poisons that they secrete onto their skin, which are used by some human populations to make poison darts, hence the name. But they've evolved a warning coloration to tell every animal that might try to eat them, hey, this is not going to end well for you, right? Because they'd rather that the organism know that before they eat them rather than afterwards. And organisms either have learned this from bad experiences and they remember that color, or sometimes they've evolved an aversion to that color over time because ancestors that avoided the coloration did better. And this is called aposematic coloration. And then we'll talk about a couple kinds of mimicry as well here in a moment. But aposematic coloration is this bright warning coloration that you often see in organisms that have some sort of effective chemical defense. So again, your poison dart frogs, or things like your monarch butterflies, which are toxic because they eat milkweed as they grow up, and so they have toxins inside of them, or bees and wasps, which have bright yellow and black coloration, which is to tell you, hey, I have a stinger and it can hurt, and you probably want to just avoid this interaction altogether. Now, you may have noticed that in one of those examples I just gave, bees and wasps, those are two entirely different organisms. I mean, they're related, but they resemble one another, right? If you're out on a summer day and you see that black and yellow warning coloration, you know what that means. And because you've seen it in so many different species, man, it hits. And so, I see it out of the corner of my eye and I jump up because even though I am a bug biologist, I still am a wimp when it comes to that stuff. They mimic one another to make that effect more pronounced in potential predator animals like me and my shoe. And this is called Mullerian mimicry, discovered by a person named Muller. Mullerian mimicry being what happens when two unpalatable species mimic one another. So in this case, the cuckoo bee and the yellow jacket, different organisms, both have similar colorations mimicking one another, and that makes the effect of this aposematic coloration that they have more pronounced. Now you, being smart biologists, may say, well, what's stopping another organism from also evolving that coloration, even if they don't have a stinger and benefiting from that warning coloration? And that's a great question, and sometimes it happens. In fact, why it doesn't happen more, is an area of further research. But it does happen, and this is called Batesian mimicry, where a harmless species, or palatable, right, I'm fine to eat, mimics an unpalatable or harmful model, like a bee, for instance, and in that way keeps away predators, right? They essentially borrow that intimidation. So here, as an example, we have a couple of snakes. Haha, just kidding. We have one snake. This is a green parrot snake. And this is a moth, but the back of its wings are colored so that when the moth holds them up in a certain way, it looks a lot like a snake with eyes on top and a snout down here, and that is scary. This is Batesian mimicry. Another great example of this is the viceroy butterfly. I mentioned that the monarch butterfly has true aposematic coloration because it is toxic and it's bad to eat. Viceroy butterflies, which you also can see around here, are also orange and black. They look very similar, but they are not toxic. They're fine to eat, but they do benefit. Studies have shown that predators tend to avoid them more because they look a lot like those beautiful monarch butterflies. I'll also note that herbivory is a kind of predation. It's plus-minus interaction, specifically where the prey species is a plant or alga that cannot move, so it has to have chemical defenses, which we talked about a lot in our plant chapter. Isn't this cute herbivory right here? Isn't that very cute herbivory?